Hi, Jan Recker.
Hey, Nick Parente.
So, Recker, I wanted to talk to you today about theory. And, in MISQ recently, there was this special issue on theory.
Yeah, I
And there
saw
are a
that.
number of papers and provocations that are coming out. And I was reading this one, and I thought of you. I was reading this one by Sudaram and Paulo Gos, right? And the reason I thought of you is because you're German. And as a German, you're clearly a representative of the design science
Of
community.
course, we're 20 seconds into this podcast and you bring racism onto the board. And I
Racism.
like that. Yeah,
Germany's
yeah, of course it's
oh,
racism. You
only a
take,
German
yeah,
would think
exactly. Only
Germans
German
a
racism.
race.
German racism is okay. Yeah, all right, go on.
Yeah, Americans don't think of Germans as a race. FYI. Uh, okay, back to the topic at hand, right? So Suda and Paulo write this paper, and I think it's fascinating because they're coming from Arizona, and Arizona has this big design science tradition, and they address really big topics, and they create artifacts, and I know some people who came out of there, and they get tons of grant funding. They create artifacts that are used in the world. So it's really, in the US anyway, a poster child for this design science tradition. And their argument is that if we're going to do high impact IS research, let's not pay attention to theory so much. All right. They don't come right out and say, theory is unnecessary, but they do say that to address design science, these high impact, they didn't need theory.
Yeah, it's
Right.
funny,
So
right? I mean, they make this one point on page 7 or something, like in a bullet point list. Oh, by the way, it doesn't matter. Theory doesn't matter. That's basically how they put that. Um, yeah, I mean, like, I would go even further. I mean, we can do all sorts of science without theory, to be honest. That's how I see it. Like, in this type of work, I mean, this is really about programmatic, high impact, large scale design science, which I think is fascinating. Not talking about a little app or whatever, but really big programs. Like they work on group decision support systems. But I would go even more general. I think theory is fine, but you can do science in IS and elsewhere without theory at all, right? And by extension, of course, you can do programmatic high impact research without theory.
yeah. So when I was reading this, it reminded me of the old debate. And my favorite papers, there's a guy, Hambrick, and I don't know, in management, if you haven't, you've probably followed it. But in management, this guy Hambrick has this paper about 2007 in AMR, where he talks about the theory fetish they have in
Yeah,
management. And I thought, MISQ, some of the IS journals and some of the IS people, you could argue we have the same kind of theory fetish, where they say,
absolutely.
"Where's the theory?" and and people really insist on the theory. So I think what this article is doing is coming out and saying, "Hey, you don't need no stinking theory to do really important work, right?"
Well, yeah, I
And
mean, I was a bit disappointed that it ended up as one little bullet point, to be honest. I mean,
yeah,
they don't really go into this. They don't really develop why programmatic high impact research doesn't need theory. It's sort of like a reflection, right? They said, oh, look, we've been doing this for 30 years, and we realized, well, a lot of that stuff really wasn't theoretically driven or whatever. They just did it, right?
it was
Which
problem driven.
Yeah, exactly. It's problem driven, which is by the way, which I find is a great approach to research to begin with, right? That theory fetish, yeah, we definitely have that, and I
So
think,
Hambrick
yeah,
argued with, against, and he even said himself that, a lot of my papers are theoretical and whatever, and I've achieved. But he pointed to things like the big sciences, right? In medicine. And, medicine, they do all sorts of things. He gives this example of cigarettes, right? And that they were unhealthy back in the 1920s. Uh, and could you imagine being that person who suspects cigarette smoking is unhealthy? Well, where's your theory? Right? Would you get published in an IS? And
yeah.
so medicine is kind of atheoretical. Talks about, astronomy. If you name a new planet, you get
Well, physics,
published, but
yeah. I
what
mean,
would
it's
happen
it's
in
the same. What I always liked is when you look at Big Bang Theory, right? That TV show, and
yeah.
that's about physicists, right? And they really neatly separate the two things. They said, well, you can be a theoretical physicist, you can be Sheldon, and you do that thing, and you can be Leonard, right? You can be the experimental scientist, and I think I personally these are two completely valid and complementary approach you do in science. Like, why do I have to do both? You know what? My problem with that is I think it's fine to do theoretical volume. It's also fine to do both. But by insisting that there has to be theory everywhere, that's actually limiting. That's actually constricting the space of all potentially high impact and valuable research we could possibly do. Yeah, I still think there is. It would be really interesting to see some nice, carefully systematic descriptive studies. Where are they? You can't do them. Not only can't you get them published, because you can't get them published, no one has an incentive of even pursuing them, right? The most obvious one there is a replication. That's why people know people do replications, because why would you? It's a lot of effort for very little gains, right?
Yeah.
Game theoretically. So, but
there's no surprise to a replication, and people, I've gotten a paper rejected for no surprise, right? Recently, I got a paper actually rejected, a different one where they say, well, everyone knows this. It's like, well, actually, everyone doesn't know this.
Well, if we learned one thing from the pandemic, there's no such thing as something that everyone knows. Like the world is full of idiots and full of all sorts of viewpoints, right? So, no, but my point is, so remember, I think around 2012, 13, 14, there was one of these theory fetish debates in IS, and I think it was in Journal of Information Technology. They had this, they had a provocation, we don't need theory, and then they had a whole bunch of people responding that theory, is needed, is king, should be a smaller king, like a prince or whatever, right? Different viewpoints. And I so happened that at that time, I was really doing a very empirically not theoretical paper. And at that time, I actually got that published in JIT because I made the argument in the paper and said, hang on, well, you just had this debate and you basically said, well, there's got to be room for descriptive papers, basically. That was one of the arguments. And said, well, here's one of them, And I'm really happy. And I think that was probably the only place where I could have possibly published that. Right? Sort of like, hey, here's an interesting thing that happened. We have lots of data on it. And we looked at it and, found a few patterns. And that's it. That's it. We don't even dare to go further than that, and we make that point very explicitly in the paper as well. So
that's kind of the classic argument against theory, right? Which is that our theory fetish. Most people aren't saying theory is not useful for anything. They're just saying that this requirement to have a theoretical contribution in order to have a contribution is stifling, and there's a lot of interesting stuff we could do.
And I think that requirement is only sociological. I think it's only because from the early days where this discipline was formed, 30 years ago, they needed to establish it and show that it's valid and rigorous and relevant, etc., and that they, it's sort of as equal as some of the older, more established disciplines in the business school. So
that's it. So that's what Hambrick says in this paper, and
that's what I believe too.
Well, there's some element to that, but let me I'll give you an argument for why theory is important beyond just trying to establish the legitimacy of our field. But before we get to that, there's what we just were talking about, which is kind of your classic argument for contributions that aren't theory, right? They're practical, they have value, they're interesting, they're, and why do you have to, I think of econometric papers that you get at MISQ that find a really good, they get a bunch of empirical data, and
they figure out which one,
root out the cause, and then they're stuck putting like resource-based view in the front because people would criticize them that there's no theory, right? I was looking recently at my buddy Brad Greenwood's paper. I don't know if you remember this. It's like 2017. It's on Uber and drunk driving fatalities in California. Right. And clearly they had to put some theory in the front. Someone at MISQ was telling them, put some theory. So they have a little like paragraph or two on platform theory, then rational choice theory. And it's like, it's irrelevant, right? They had to put those theories, I could imagine, in the front. And then they quickly did some econometric gymnastics to pull out the fact that when Uber was introduced in California, drunk driving fatalities indeed did decrease, right? So they got media coverage. It's important. It's interesting. It shows that the sharing economy impacts things, and they did it right. Do we really need theory to make that empirical contribution? So
I give you a different argument, which is sort of scientific. So Popper, right? Popper, we talked about the scientific method and falsification, etc. Theory development, that was for him. That wasn't even part of science. He couldn't care less where the hypothesis came from. He was more interested. Okay, we have one now. Let's deal with this. And if you think about it, why does a hypothesis have to be grounded in theoretical logic? Why can't it just simply be my guess? An informed guess.
Well,
and then I'll do some, really systematic blah, blah, blah work and then figure out whether my guess was correct. And that would be interesting and, and insightful and everything. So.
Well, Popper wanted bold conjectures, right? To go away from. So he was in a time when he was arguing against this very precise deductive view of science, right? This axiomatic, syllogistic view of science, where he was arguing against kind of the logical positivist view, where we had to derive from axiomatic rules. So it's kind of a strict view of theory. But what he was talking about was theory. He called them bold conjectures, and he just thought we should, subject them to strict tests. They should be falsifiable conjectures. And axiomatic, right, syllogistic statements were not subject to falsifications, right? So he was arguing a kind of an empirical point. It wasn't really it was against a particular way of doing theory, but I don't think it was theoretical, right?
Well, I'm not
and I guess
saying
that's what we have to parse.
The point that I wanted to make is more that that wasn't really part of the scientific process. It's sort of, okay, that part is a little bit decoupled, and you can do it in various ways, but really it gets interesting once we have the hypothesis, wherever it originated from, and then there's a series of tests and all sorts of steps that we need to go through, and I kind of like that. For one thing, I think it's very nice to separate hypothesis from theory. That's one thing, and if you do that, then you could have a broader range of hypotheses that are worth exploring. Right. That's what I mean. Like it would just open up the realm and give us. Yeah, that's a good idea.
Because I need to come back to these points, because you're totally derailing me from my original points, right? I had an agenda that I wanted to talk to you about, and I knew you would buy my first part of the agenda. And the first part of the agenda is, yes, there's this argument for contributions that are not necessarily rooted in theory. And being a good German, you went with me, right? And that's like the classic argument for there are all these contributions, including design. There's a newer argument, and it's the big data argument against theory, right? Yeah. And it was first captured by Anderson in Wired magazine. They had this famous article said the end of theory, right? Yeah. Which is the idea.
We got prediction. We don't need explanation, basically.
Right. So now that we can predict the heck out of everything, who needs any stinking theory, right? We can just, isolate the impact of variables on variables and be, do we really need theory, right? And that's kind of and there's a machine learning form of that argument, right? Which is, again, I'm not sure, but that's like the new version of the same argument, that there's a lot of interesting and impactful stuff we can do without actually understanding it from a mechanism standpoint or an explanatory standpoint.
Like, that's where I would actually go and jump in and defend theory, so to speak, right? Because I think, well, that just doesn't gel well with my understanding of what I'm meant to do, right? So I like doing scientific work and doing research in order to analyze and explain. I know there's prediction, and I know it's important to be prescriptive even, and then, create impact and so forth. But really, I want to understand the world, I want to figure out what these mechanisms are. And if I want to figure out what the mechanisms are, I'm talking about, that's on a theoretical level. So if I can only predict, but I don't know how and why that works, I wouldn't be satisfied, That's not enough for me. So in this case, in this big data, predictive, and so forth, see, that's funny, because now I reverse my argument and say, like, well, really there, I want to have that theoretical view on the mechanism.
Now, why is it any different? When you're creating an artifact to solve a problem, you're essentially implementing something based on some prediction. You're predicting. Yeah. Now, maybe it's not rooted in machine learning, but you're predicting that this artifact is going to do something in the world.
And work in a certain way, etc. Exactly. Right. You have some sort of expectation, and that could be
that expectation, if it's atheoretical and not based on what we understand about the world, right? It's just you just want to see what works, right? You put it out there. Isn't that the same logic as the machine learning prediction?
Well, isn't that the same logic as scientific method and saying, right, I'll have a hypothesis and I'm gonna, run a test and see if it works, and if it not, I'll discard it and figure out a different one. So when I build an artifact equipped with an expectation, okay, that's gonna help these people doing something, and then I do it and I realize it doesn't work or it doesn't help them. Well, then I go back and try to design a new one, right?
So here's where I differ from the not. So first off, just to be clear, I think we should be publishing in MISQ more atheoretical stuff in a particular way, and I'll get into that in a minute. But I would argue that the traditional argument, the design science argument that I'm reading in Suda and Paulo's article, and that I think of when I think of the German design science community, of which I end up reviewing a bunch of their papers over the years. It's create an artifact. And I don't need theory to create an artifact. We've created artifacts. I just need to, create this artifact based on solving a problem. Similarly, I need to do predictions based on my machine learning algorithm. This is like the new form. I don't need theory. I think it's the same argument. And the reason we can do it is because, for example, in building artifacts, you're coming out in the sciences, for example, is because engineering comes from physics. Physics is making the kind of fundamental theoretical discoveries. Engineering uses that to solve the problems in kind of a high paradigm context. So it's not that it's atheoretical. It's got a very strong, well-defined theoretical base to such an extent that they don't have to talk about it anymore.
Yeah, but I agree with it, but you got to draw the boundary somewhere where it's saying, well, this is part of science and this is not. I mean, and the engineering is an interesting example of that. Let me go back to this Big Bang Theory metaphor. You know how Sheldon always makes fun of Wolowitz, who's the engineer, right? And he does cool stuff. He goes to the moon and he builds the Mars rover, and he's certainly a good engineer. But they always jokingly say, "Well, you're not a scientist. You're just an engineer." Like let's forget about the qualification. That's good and the other one's bad. But I think there's a difference. See, what I liked about design science is always to say, well, where's the distinction between doing design and doing design science? Or research or design sort of in a researchy way. And I always thought that was a lot easier to make and to do when you involve theory. Now I know there's different camps on this, and there's people, people like Shirley, she would say, well, design and theory, and Al and also Suda here, they would say, well, I can do design without theory. Of course you can, of course you can, but is that then research? Should MIS Quarterly or some other journal publish that, right? I mean, why don't you just go and do that? This is the same thing that I have with this programmatic, high impact, relevant research. Well, I can do that. Why don't I have to write a paper about that?
Yep.
I worked with these bakeries in Australia for years, right? And we solved problems for the bakeries, and they're better now.
Yeah.
There's no paper in there, but I did it and solved the problem. They're happier. They make more money. That's relevant, and it was sort of researchy because I did research, but that's not published, and it will, never will, so to speak.
And it probably shouldn't be. Or at least some of it shouldn't be, unless you had some clever insight while you're doing it. And that's really my big problem.
Every developer that builds a system should write a paper about it. So we, and for that, to make that decision, we need some criteria. And for example, one of these could be theory. There might be others, but their theory is really helpful just to make that distinction.
Well, you just nailed it. Should everyone who builds a system write a paper about it? Should everyone who comes up with a new notation and has some justification for the notation write a paper about it? Should everyone who comes up with a new algorithm write a paper about it, right? Not every notation is ER diagrams, right? It's not going to have that impact, right? And the German tradition has notations for everything, most of which never impacted a thing, but you could point to Scheer or someone, with his EPC diagrams, and you could say, well, that one had an impact. Well, that one did, but to make that one, we needed a whole bunch that didn't. And
moreover, also the guys like Scheer and others, they had a career too, So he also published, not in the quarterly, but he wrote books and stuff, and he was successful on many levels, and he's really well regarded, at least in the community as well. So that's what I mean. If we make more room for this variety of approaches, then there's no downside to it, I think.
should
Which makes
we
it harder
shouldn't
to
we be
evaluate, I think.
different? So there are a lot of papers that are essentially, especially in the like 2010 to 2020 in that range there, a bunch of papers got in that were on one level, you could just think of them as A/B testing, right? Where they did something on a website and it changed buying patterns, and then they wrote a paper about it, right? Uh, there are a whole bunch of these. So A/B testing, they do that at a scale that we academics can't even begin to do out in industry. Amazon does it, right? A lot of this machine learning stuff Google's doing. Should we be in the IS field? Should we be doing the same thing Google's doing? Should we be doing the same thing Amazon's doing, and probably worse than they're doing it in some ways? And without theory, that's essentially what we're doing. Isn't theory the thing that distinguishes us from the people
Yeah, I
doing?
mean, that's why I have this pretty classic view on that's why I use that word science a lot, but because I really do think this old method and this old idea of, science is going out and finding an explanation for how and why something works. I mean, that which is a theory, right?
Yeah.
So that's fine. Like I see, that's another thing. Why do I have to do this programmatic high impact work? Why do I have to? Why can't I just keep doing my archaeological stuff? Why can't I just wait to see what happens, analyze it, and explain it why and how that worked or didn't work? In
Yeah.
hindsight, yeah, of course I can't shape the future, but I help understanding the world around us and maybe our history even, right? So I think that's fine.
And what's really funny is to go back to this particular paper, they bring up iPlant, or now called Cybers, right? Which is this big kind of cyber infrastructure project that's a huge success here in the US, and it did come out of Arizona. Um, but it's multidisciplinary, right?
Yeah.
There are many, it's a success. So there are many different fathers of success, if you will, right? The people in plant genetics, actually, in Arizona and at UT Austin and some other places that were involved, actually claim. People in supercomputer centers, right, that had to do with, they're claiming this particular project, right? There are a whole bunch of different disciplines that are claiming this project. And clearly in this paper, they're saying, well, some of the things we did contributed to this project as well. And I have no doubt that it did. But what I think is interesting, by their own uh, kind of examples, they're undercutting, in a sense, the information systems contributions, right? They're talking about bigger multidisciplinary contributions, and those bigger multidisciplinary contributions, we can certainly be. I've been involved with cyber infrastructure stuff here in the U.S. as well. We can be part of that, right? That's not IS research. IS research is a part of this interdisciplinary thing, along with plant genetics, along with supercomputing, along with whoever else is at the table. So should we be part of it in addressing these grand problems? Sure. But that doesn't mean that that's the totality of IS research. You and I might want to just go look at some game development company and see what they're doing in their design using procedural generation, which we did. There's nothing wrong with that. We're not necessarily solving a grand challenge, but we're understanding maybe how a company,
Well, I
does
like the
something.
idea. I like the idea that we look more at grand challenges. I really do. It also coupled with the idea that we sort of open up even more to do different ways of doing research about it. And if you want, you could be prescriptive. You can design stuff. I don't care, right? As long, but always as a complement, not as a substitute. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
and the other thing, so I think we're just in a fortunate position. We can contribute to all these grand challenges research because everything is connected to the digital anyway, right? You can't talk about climate change without digital technology. You can't solve the vaccination problems for COVID without digital processes like the drug discovery, etc. Right? So that's why we can contribute because everything that matters on this planet at the moment speaks to the phenomena that interests us. It's all
Have you,
socio-technical and it's all involves digital, etc. and so forth.
And
So
that's
that's
actually the
cool
beauty of our field, right?
at the
Which is
moment.
at any table, if it's a bunch of people who are talking about organizations and humans, I show up and I can be the technical person that also understands, or if I'm talking to the technical people, I can show up and I'll be the organizational
Yeah.
behavioral person, right? So,
I,
so
I
that's the,
personally think this is the golden age, and I've said that a few times. I think I'm worried about it because I'm not sure we're as a field in a good position to take advantage of it.
we're in a great position if we knew how to do it, right? And you and
That's
I have
exactly
talked
what I
about
mean.
this.
And we don't have the right attitudes, we don't have the right processes, and we don't have the right incentive systems either. By the way, like so. Let's say you do this. Let's say you work directly on the climate change program, or you're involved in the drug discovery process for Pfizer, right? why the hell would you then come back and write a paper to ISR or MI's quarterly? You know, like this is it's a
Yeah, well,
complete
I think
conflict,
you're
right?
right. The incentives are a little bit weird. They're skewed, right? We're counting papers in top journals as opposed to looking at scholarship. So there's a
Yeah.
reason for that, right? And it's because we can't assess each other's work. We're so, and it's getting so messy. Organizational scholarship, management scholarship, IAS research, right? And it's all over. It's very difficult for a behavioral person, an experimental person, to kind of assess an econometrician's work, a qualitative person's work, right? So since not everyone can assess we need some common denominator, right, to be able to compare an econometrician to a qualitative researcher in its top tier publications. And it's unfortunate, but that's where we've come.
I have no problem with that, to be honest, right? So because I'm still old enough to remember the times where we didn't have that, and that was worse because there back then assessment was all just based on communicative action, basically, on reputation building mechanisms. The person that screamed the loudest was the elephant in the room, that sort of thing, right? So this is a bit more transparent and objective. So that's better, and it is comparable. I get that, but it's also, it creates a game that people want to win, and you can't do any of this stuff. You can't do theoretical work, programmatic, high impact stuff if you're trying to maximize your points per year.
Which is what
Like
people are doing.
which is what not everyone, but what many people are doing, which means that the overall research resources that we have, most of them are just doing things that are not very productive. They're maximizing their output per year. They're very productive in that sense, but they're not doing the research that perhaps they should be doing. Because that, it'll take longer. It'll be harder to publish if publish it at all. We talked about this. So, yeah.
So let
And
me
I
give
worry
you the
about
case.
that. Yeah.
Let me give you the case for theory, and I get it from our artificial intelligence special issue at MISQ. Right? Here's AI, and you and I have discussed this, right? AI. What is AI? AI is always what we're about to do in computing, right? When back in the '60s, when we were writing algorithms that formerly humans did, I mean, those algorithms were basically, you know,
It's a form
artificial
of
intelligence,
artificial intelligence,
you
absolutely,
know.
right? If you can
Uh,
compute it for us, then that's pretty intelligent.
Expert systems in the 80s,
Yeah.
and then now, of course, machine learning. We call it artificial intelligence, but it's basically computing. So a lot of what we've learned in the last 50 years can apply. But then you read these papers, and we got many submitted to our special issue, where they're just like recreating a bad form of some old insight that we had about IT. So our field is positioned well to say, maybe read some of that old stuff, update it, and say we have something to say about the current version of AI. People don't want to do that. It's much nicer to. But and the other problem too is that old. So this is the argument for theory, right? The cumulative tradition, and that if you are going to, the difference between science and non-science is that science understands what's
Yeah.
happening and builds on the cumulative tradition of what's happening and extends it, right? That's science. And if you don't understand the cumulative tradition and you're not looking to move it forward, that's not science. What you're doing is just doing stuff, which one could argue, no matter how important it is that you're doing it, and how cutting edge you're doing, you're still just doing. It's not science. You're doing important work that the civilization may need, but you don't call yourself a scientist until you understand the cumulative tradition. And I think there are too many people who don't want to understand the cumulative tradition because it's fun to do the correlations that they're currently finding, or develop the artifacts that they want, or going out to the field and talking to people about digital transformation. There are all these things they want to do, and you're going to make me.
No, but like Nick, from a realist perspective, a little bit, right? You say that, but also you're probably one of the most, one of the persons that I know that reads the most. I mean, you have read broadly and deeply with stuff that's old and new, right? Most people do not do that, and most scientists in our field do not do that. I think you can bring down the people that have read Gadamer and Foucault and Ricoeur and others. There won't be many. So it's easy for you to say that you realize that some ideas that's floating around now has been proposed some time before. People don't know that because they haven't read it. You know, so you know what I mean? Like you seem
Yeah.
to be on a pedestal and you look at everybody else. So I don't know what the answer now is. Give
All right. So basically,
everybody
you
100
complimented
books to
me.
read before they start.
You complimented me that I read, and then you told me that I'm this arrogant bastard on a pedestal looking down upon my fellow
Well,
humans.
both of
Okay.
which are facts. Yeah, but you know, like see, like really, really pragmatically, like I look at doctoral students, and I get to see a lot of them, right? So you know, they haven't read at that point, and the way that they then engage in their training, they usually don't read either. Not that sort of stuff. They read the papers and they read the editorials, and that's why even now in 2021 they have a view on rigor versus relevance and theory versus empirics, and you know they read that, but they don't read the philosophers of the 40s and the 50s,
Yeah.
unless they have a an advisor that for some other reason coerces them to do that, you
Yeah.
know. But that's the reality. So
Yeah.
it's easy to say
So we
that there
can't
is stuff
expect
from the
that.
50s that apply. Yeah, maybe we need to. Maybe we need to change the I don't know, the training to say, well, you want to do a PhD, the first year you got to read these books, and then we'll
Well, that
talk.
was my PhD. But
I know
let's
that was
cut.
your
So,
PhD, but
so
it wasn't
th-
everyone's.
these are two extremes, and let me propose a middle road. And this is the American pragmatist middle road, right? So the one extreme we could call it and William James, talk about old guys, right? He talked about it. He talked about it, the tough-minded empiricist. Okay, he had this. I think it's his book on pragmatism. Uh, yeah, it's called On Pragmatism. It's one of his lectures, and there were two types of people. There were the tough-minded empiricist who wants facts, facts. Give me hard facts. That's what I need. Don't give me this. And then there were the what he called the tender-minded uh, uh, idealists, right? And we could think of it as the people who want theory, right? These are the ones who are in the realm of ideas, right? The realm of concepts, the thinkers, the ones who go back and read and make connections and all of that, right? And he said that even at his time, the scholarship was a battle between the tough-minded empiricist and the tender-minded idealists,
But
and
it's
he put them both kind of in the same category and said that what, they're both right. Clearly we want facts and we want more of them, but we also want ideas, right? We can't just live in the world of brute facts. And Sutton in 1995 called it uh, abstracted empiricism. He called it dust bowl empiricism, was his actual word. Just this arid, vacant space of just playing with facts. You don't know anything, but you can build an artifact, or you can do an algorithm, or analyze some data, right? Versus and he said, well, we clearly need both. So it's this combination of, we need some attention to the cumulative tradition, and then we need some, and no one person has to do both, right? We
that's my
should.
point as well.
Yeah.
I like that, but I think that we got to make room for both, and we shouldn't expect of everyone to be able to do both, right?
Yeah.
Why can't I take my doctoral students and train half of them to be really good experimenters? They have no idea, but I can give them the idea, and then say, you go into your lab and you run that. And you're my survey
The
guy, and you're my case
methodologists
study guy.
versus
Yeah,
the.
exactly, right. And so we gotta have room for that, and we do, right? And to some extent, we do. We do have some people that made careers out of being methodologists. And they end up on all sorts of papers, and they don't really care about the phenomenon
Yep.
or the theory, but they always make sure that whatever, that case study is done well and that experiment is
Yeah.
done well, etc. I think, but at the moment, our systems, they sort of favor either the guy that can do both, or the idealist.
Yeah.
Certainly not the
Well,
empiricist. You
Well, I
know,
don't know about that. Look at the econometric tradition in IS right now. The empiricists are very much now. When they run
well,
into a theory
they're on the up.
person,
Yeah,
they
yeah.
get beat up, but they're doing quite well. All right. I'll buy what you're saying to an extent, especially now since so much of what we do is collaborative. That if someone is
I can train them
a,
as specialists, and just then I have to just mix them well.
a methodological specialist could, given the right network, achieve at a very high level, right? The problem is, like econometrics, is throw a rock, you can hit three econometricians. Having that as your, competitive advantage is not that great, because there are a lot of them. Now, if you're very cutting edge with your econometrics, or if you're a very hard worker that can just do a lot more than others, then great. But you should actually have something where you're moving the knowledge forward and just applying a skill to me kind of goes against here's the middle path. The middle path is this: understand the conversation in a domain, right? This is the old conversant idea. This is the conversation. Understand, and you can be a specialist in a method or not, but you should understand what people know about a domain. And I think, at least in my work and in what I see with more junior people, is they're kind of pulled to multiple domains somehow, right? And they don't have the time to become really an expert in a particular domain, or maybe the incentives aren't aligned in a domain, or something like that. But people seem to be pulled because they want to analyze the data sets they have. They're pulled into, right?
Yeah, and I get that. I mean, like they just need more time, and the reading part, which I think is important, is just not the most sexy of them, right? Of course, you want to get your hands dirty with the data and stuff, right? I get that, right? So but with time, these people build up that expertise, and you see that this is why they're struggling, because they do not understand the conversations and the conversions yet, because it's just they're learning that, I guess. And then the good ones read a lot, and they read well, and they read quickly, which is another thing we could talk about, about the speed of reading quickly, and sort of scanning papers for what the key points are. If you're really good at that, then you can read a lot, and then you understand a lot, and you can contribute to a lot of areas, right?
So you're buying my point about conversation.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
You don't need to know all of the foundational, just know the recent conversation in your domain and extend it. So don't just say, hey, and to pick on Greenwood's paper, Uber and, drunk driving, right? It's addresses platform and rational choice. That's kind of clearly posted in the front, because the 2 paragraphs on platform and the 2 paragraphs on rational choice in that paper, and I don't remember what is actually in the front, but it's something like that. No one cares about, because everybody just cares about his empirical findings, right? Uber reduced drunk driving fatalities in California. So cool. That's the important thing. Now the question is, well, do other people have to study drunk driving in other areas? Do they? No, it's good enough. Most of us now know that it seems to have some impact. We buy it, and it's further. We don't need. But now, if you abstract it up a little bit, and you think, okay, what do sharing platforms do to a region or an economy? Or they create certain alternative. There's and in that work, to be fair, that sharing economy work, they do cite each other, and they do say, look, this person found out that Craigslist does this and in a region. But I think that step in abstraction, do they need to do it themselves, the people doing this kind of cool empirical work? Or does someone else need to come and do the abstraction for them? And if they're all happy not abstracting it up, right? Isn't that what's wrong with that, right? So
well, I think there's a difference here between doing that research and building that tradition versus having a paper or whatever goes into that paper. Right? That's just a snapshot of some segment of work they've been doing in a particular point in time, and it's socially constructed. There's this review process, and they want you to put this stuff in there, and this other stuff goes out, and so forth. And there's other things you only have so and so much space. So I think it's a poor representation, right? So in that, pretty naturally, we know that naturally, over time, that tradition would give you room to do all these things that you talked about, to connecting it to other regions, to abstracting it, to exploring whether there are other mechanisms that explain why it has that impact, and so forth. Do they need to do that? No, absolutely not. They did this one little puzzle piece, and we have some poor representation of that in the form of that paper. And I would bet, I haven't asked Brett about this, but I would bet that no, they did not start with rational choice theory. They probably just got the data, had a look at it, found some interesting pattern, and wrote it up, and then sort of framed everything else. And this is where we both agree. That's sort of stupid that they had to put that in there. Right?
Yeah, why did they
doesn't add
just
anything.
Publish the? Yep. So this is what I think it should have been, and this is what I think we should do as a field in MISQ right now. Whatever, I don't know what the percentage is, 80 or 90% of our papers are regular papers in MISQ, and then some small portion are research notes.
I think it should be portion is theory papers, because there is this category, but you have
that theory and review, which also I have a comment on. This is what I think should happen. I think 80 or 90% of our papers should be research notes. This would help us.
Okay.
All right. Most of what I get as an AE there should be a research note. And instead of doing this pretense of forcing Brad to put some bullshit about platforms and rational choice in the front. Just let him write a paper with good, solid econometrics. Let a lot of the robustness checks and stuff be like footnotes and in the review process. It doesn't have to make it in the final research note. We can trust it, right? Just make them all research notes. Make them the typical contribution to MISQ is a research note. Your
Few
experiment,
articles that really
it's a
deserve the
note,
room to
your
be
economy.
longer. Yeah.
And then the full articles are the ones that say, here's the cumulative tradition at an abstract level. And they do a good job. And then we take the pressure off. I did a cool experiment. I have a cool hypothesis, a cool finding. I take the pressure off that paper. I make it a research note. And then we have some that actually do look at, the history of privacy research in MIS Quarterly and other top journals, and go out to psychology and really do a strong job on the theory of and then move it forward as an actual theoretical contribution. And then that would give us editors a nice recourse instead of forcing that a lot of people who don't, and design science as well. I made this artifact, instead of forcing them to then compare it with an artifact, put some theory in the front, show how their artifact, it moves our theory forward. No, you know what? This is a novel artifact. This is different. Let's publish it without the baggage, right?
Well, I like, but just a small point on that. I mean, I do like the fact that this design science involves evaluation, because it really helps you to shore it up a lot better. I do like the fact that they have to evaluate the utility or whatever the outcome is. For example, by comparing a bunch of artifacts or comparing the presence of the artifact to some other. Like, I think that really scientifically boosts it all up. So
I think Germans are learning that, by the way, because they used to, in maybe 10 years ago when I first got papers, maybe at ISR when I was there, from when they Germans hit the US journal market by storm after the big thing they wrote in Aegis, which is, you have to, you know what I'm talking about? The manifesto.
Yeah, let's not talk about that here. Yeah.
But then, so what I think I saw early was we built this artifact, we tested it, it works, right? More recently, what I see is we built this artifact, we tested it against the next best artifact, or we tested it against something else. So it wasn't just we tested it and it works, it's we tested it and it improves something over the other thing.
See,
so I think just that step is a big step forward.
Like in Australia, I was in an IT faculty basically, right? And so there were guys, they were really software engineer, computer scientists. I mean, they did amazing evaluations. They had new algorithms, that was usually their contributions, and they had this really extensive range of evaluations, usually with simulations, with formal proofs, with complexity analysis, plus usually some sort of user adoption, user acceptance empirics as well, all of that. And it ended up on the last page, sort of this is section 7, maybe an appendix, maybe, what they also do is they got this paper and they got the associated technical report, which is 80 pages with details, but anyway, so they're really good at this, right? And you don't see that in our field very often, but the IEEEs and ICM journals are full of that. So I wanted to go back to another point. You said, well, you want to make the main paper category a research note, short, sharp, empirical articles, that's it, poof.
And don't even call it a research note, just
whatever, right? So the short paper, and here it is what it is. So you gotta admit that as editors, who we are, we have the leeway to do so. For example, in this Managing AI special issue that we are editing together, that's coming out later this year, we do have papers exactly like that. So we are accepting papers that exactly fit the bill that we're discussing here, and we have the freedom to do so, right? So we should point that out as well.
Yeah. And all right, so I have to bring something up. I brought up the manifesto and you said we're not going to talk about that here. So why are we not talking about that here? That's because you're German and because it's a politically charged German issue, and the people in charge of German academia kind of were on the manifesto. So therefore you don't want to...
I know very little about it, for one thing. So first of all, you should probably clear up for listeners. You're talking about the Manifesto for Design Science Research. That was basically a short paper arguing for that particular strand to be more accepted, I guess. And it had a list of signatures from about, I can't remember, like a long list of names of mostly German professors that signed this memorandum. Right. Yeah. So that was the one. Around 2008 or 9 or 10, I can't remember. See, I was in Australia.
Yeah, my advisor, Kalle Luttinen, was JAIS editor-in-chief, and he wrote the response with the other editors-in-chief.
Yeah, I saw that too, right? So there was a response, and see, I wasn't really involved, I hadn't heard about it. I only found out about it when I saw it published, and together with the response from Cully and Detmar as well, right? Everyone that was an
Detmar.
editor, yeah, and others. Anyway, so at that time, and still, I'm on the side of the responses, right? So I felt there was a lot of problems with his memorandum, just in terms of the wording and how aggressive it was. It made a point, I guess, a political point they wanted to make, I suppose. I think they could have done this in a different way. Um, and also, I don't think that a lot of the things that they said were true, because I get a lot, like you, I get a lot of design science research submissions as an editor. In fact, I don't. That's the thing. I never get these. So where are all these papers that you apparently can't publish? I think they're not being submitted. I never get them. So I think that's more the reality. So I think there is room, and I think the editors at the time already pointed out, look, we got people on the boards, we publish these papers, do send them in. I think very simply my view on that is the quality back then wasn't really up to the standards that were expected in the field, and by now they are. We should also point that out. Yeah. So.
Yeah. Well, anyway, so we came full circle to design science research, and
Yeah, we started with this and talked about theory and came back to
I
it.
think the bottom line is there's a role for theory, and the role for theory is the attention to the cumulative tradition. And every article shouldn't have it necessarily, but a lot of the articles should, and that's when you get to and then but I also agree with you that we should be playing more in the journals, right? A journal
be
paper
playing.
is not the end all statement of something, but we can put good findings out. We can,
And I also don't think, like, if you opened up and make it a bit more pluralistic and allowed for these different types of forms of knowledge to be created and published and so forth, that does not mean that theory will disappear. It's not that then all of a sudden no one will care about theory, because as I said, like, I still have that romantic view. I think it's still fundamentally at the core of why people choose to become a scientist, because they want to understand and explain. And as long as that's the case, you will have people that develop theoretical contribution, that think of as abstractions, and that write pure theory papers and so forth. So just because you give room to others doesn't take away that you won't have that. So I wouldn't be worried about this. I think there would just be more room. I just don't want us to be constrained to one particular form, a genesis of knowledge, and that would be good. But maybe we can do this, right? So in this special issue, I think we've taken some bold steps in some of the papers that we're accepting, because they fit what we think is right. I mean, well, one that's our job as editor, right? That's what we're supposed to do. But we'll see what the reaction will be, I guess.
Anyway, Wrecker, it's always fun to talk to you. Let's do it again.
Well, we'll do it again. Next time I'll propose a topic.
Sounds good.
We'll talk about something interesting then. Alrighty. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.